When I was preparing for this lesson this morning, I felt like I was experiencing a bit of a deja vu. It's like, oh, it was only a few weeks ago that I was talking about the role of women in the church, and then numerous lessons that followed and sermons that followed after that, have been spoken since to the effect of how can we become members of the Lord's church, and what are some of the different roles that we can have in the church. This morning, I'll be teaching on the topic of the role of everyone being involved in the church. Now, we've spoken about the different roles, the numerous roles that one can have, but what about the involvement in those roles? What is involvement, the word involvement, supposed to be like, right? And as I studied some more about the topic and this topic of involvement, I noticed that there's a distinct difference between a role and being involved in that role. Besides the spelling, of course, of role and involvement. A person can be given a role or a task, right? But they can choose to not be involved or engaged in that role. In modern times, as we've read the papers today in secular world, we have this term called quiet quitting. You go, what is quiet quitting? Quiet quitting is doing your job to the bare minimum requirements, operating on battery saver mode, not excelling, not engaged, not being involved, just being there, right? So a person, again, as I said, can be given a role, but can choose to not be involved and engage in that role. So is it okay then? I'll ask the question today, is it okay then for us to wear the name Christian, but not be involved or active in the Lord's group of people called the church? The short answer is no, and we're done with the lesson this morning. All right? If we read in the book of James, if we turn our Bibles now to the book of James, chapter 2. James chapter 2, verses 14 to 24. I'll read those few verses. James chapter 2, verses 14 to 24. Excuse me. In verse 14, it reads, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." Now, today's lesson is simple. All right, we answered the question. It's simple, but it's not about the simplicity of it. The message is simple, but the change is hard. Okay? However, the consequences or the rewards are eternal. So Jesus said this in the book of Matthew. In the book of Matthew, chapter 7 and verse 21, Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." The word "do" or "does" in this verse, in Matthew chapter 7, is an action word, right? It's verb, an action verb. Something must be done once it is known. If you saw someone trying to jump off a bridge, but you did not do anything to stop it. But then you see someone else running along and pulling that person to safety. Can you say that you were involved in saving that person? Can you say that you were involved in that incident? No, right? In that scenario that I just mentioned, you are merely a witness to that scenario. You were just there in the vicinity, in the background, part of the scenery, right? In Singapore and Malaysia, we've got quite a few Singaporeans and Malaysians here. We like to use this term called calafate. All right, calafate. And for us in the room who don't know what that word means, I'll refresh us. Calafate is the word calafate is used to refer to someone who is an extra in a film or in a place. Someone that is insignificant to the plot of the drama or the movie, right? So that is what you are in that scenario where you're just watching, not doing anything. You are a calafate, right? Part of the scenery. Involvement, the word involvement here. Involvement means participation. Involvement means action, to have a hand in, to collaborate, connection, inclusion, right? It is the opposite of someone who is involved, it is the opposite who is someone who is a calafate, right? A non-significant, blending into the crowd. That is the opposite of involvement, right? Before I continue my lesson this morning, right, I would like to just say that I'm not here to judge anyone, all right? I was once and for a very long time, I would admit that I was a calafate in the church myself, right? But someone a few years ago provoked me to change my level of involvement from 0. And I can put my hand on heart and confess that, when that happened, it was a very bitter pill to swallow myself. But it caused me, to take action and to then get involved, and it led me to where I am today. So I am eternally grateful to that sister in Christ. But my intent this morning, to come back to my point, my intent here is not to sound self-righteous, but to hopefully achieve that which was said in the book of Hebrews chapter 10. Let's turn our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 to 25, which is what I hopefully get across to us in terms of what my tone or attitude to this lesson is today. It says in verse 24, Hebrews chapter 10, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. The word stir up in verse 24, Hebrews chapter 10, means to provoke, to stimulate, to incite, to work someone up. Now, hopefully my lesson this morning will stir us up to be more loving and to do more good works, just as I myself was stirred up those many years back. And I can tell you, it says provoke, right? So what's such an aggressive word, provoke? Well, you know why? I can tell you when I was provoked many years back, I was angry in that very moment, right? But you know what was funny? I didn't know who I was angry at. I was just angry when I heard that, right? And I didn't know until I reflected on it. And I came to the realization that the person that I was really angry at was not that sister in Christ. It was myself. It was because I was embarrassed. And it was because I was guilty of not being involved, right? And it is quite common for us to feel that way, not in just a church setting, in any setting. When someone comes to you and accuse you of not doing something or tell you or give you constructive criticism, sometimes you get angry. And you go, wow, why am I angry? And it's because you are embarrassed or you feel guilty because you are exactly as that person has described. And you are then aware of it and shame of it. And that was how I felt, And I knew that I gave as many reasons. You got two choices. One is to fight or flight, right? I tried to defend myself, but you know what? I knew that my reasons for non-involvement were not scriptural in any way, shape, or form. And most importantly, my defenses and my answers or my rebuttals to the question would not hold up with God. And so, since I will lose the battle anyway, ultimately, I tried to change. You've got two choices. God always gives us a choice. Do nothing or do something. Right? So I chose to go, and I'll do something about it. And slowly, I became more involved. Right? So coming back to the question that we want to answer today, this morning, is, do all members have a role of involvement? Do all members have a role of participation? To have a hand in, to have action in, to have inclusion in, collaboration in the church? This lesson will cover 4 points. And 4 points it will cover is the attitude towards involvement. And then point number 2 is that all must be involved on a couple of bases. Number 3 is some examples of actions of involvement. And lastly, what are the advantages? What are these rewards that we'll expect to see or reap when we are involved in the church? So, excuse me. To my first point, what should our attitude be like towards involvement in the church? So I'm pretty sure that all of us here today are very involved in our secular roles outside of the church, in our jobs, in our schools, in our houses, our families, in our friends. We have a very good, most of us, if not all of us, have a very good work ethic, right? We are very hard workers in the office, and we put our very best efforts to be involved in social and business activities with our co-workers, our neighbors, and our friends. But let me ask you the question, do we put the same effort into our church activities? Some of us have very important jobs outside of the church. Some of us have some jobs that we have are even life-saving, right? The church, the group that we're a part of, has the greatest work on earth. The church has the responsibility of seeking and saving the lost. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 28. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 28 in verse 18 to verse 20, right? And he recorded this, the Bible records this again in Mark 16, 15 to 16, which reads, and he said to them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. So after reading these verses, one cannot claim anymore that they did not know anything about the command for us to go, for us to get involved in saving lost souls. What is our attitude then? Knowing that this command is for us, what is our attitude towards fulfilling this command for us to go and to work? Now let us look at an example of a fellow Christian who had the right attitude towards doing this command, this work that was recorded for us. Let's turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58. In his first letter to the Corinthian brethren, Paul wrote this. Paul said, Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Now, Paul also exhorted Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2. He penned this to Timothy in that book in chapter and verse, saying, Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. And we can see in those few verses that Paul certainly had what? Passion. There's the exclamation marks if you read the verses as well, right? Preach the word, his exhortation to Timothy, right? So he had passion. Paul had great passion. Paul had great zeal for being involved in the work. And if we are familiar with Paul's journey, he had 3 missionary trips around Asia. Is it Asia Minor? At the time, and he didn't do it easily. He went through a lot of trouble doing those trips. Not 1, not 2, but 3 times. It's like going to a tour in Afghanistan, not once, but 3 times around, right? Paul did that and was passionate every single time, and he was involved till the day he died. So Paul said this at the end of his life. Paul said this in this book of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 to 8. Paul wrote that I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Paul knew of the rewards. He was involved, and he knew what he was doing and what he was getting himself involved in, and he knew what was awaiting for him at the end of the day as well, at the end of the tunnel. Right? For us Christians today then, are we confident, as Paul was, are we confident in our attitude towards our involvement in the church, just as Paul was? Are we sure of ourselves? To repeat Paul's words that was captured for us in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 4 that we just read. To do so, we need to have the same attitude as Paul did, and to actively involve ourselves in carrying out the Lord's will, right? So that is the type of attitude that we should have. Now, point number 2 this morning is, the second point is that I would like to touch on is that all of us here must be involved. None of us excluded. All are included. All must be involved. Now, the Great Commission was written to all Christians, all of us who are in the church. The Great Commission was to go and to preach the word to everyone. And it was directed to all of us. So each Christian now has the responsibility, has the role of involvement. Right? If we read Acts chapter 8, if we turn our Bibles to the book of Acts chapter 8, verse 1 to 4, we can see from those verses that it was the members of the church and not some select few who were involved in spreading the gospel message during the first century time. Let's quickly read those verses in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. So, this is not deacons or preachers going around spreading the word. It was Christians who were scattered everywhere, who went about preaching the word, who were involved in spreading the gospel. So furthermore, I might suggest this morning in point number 2 that our involvement, when all of us are involved, our involvement should be based on 3 things, right? Our involvement should be based on the Great Commission, which we just mentioned. Our involvement also should be based on our talents, or accounting to our talents and our abilities. And our involvement also should be based on our unconditional love for lost souls. So as I mentioned earlier in the lesson, we must acknowledge that we all have been given a command, an authoritative order from our supreme leader, not Kim Jong-un, but our supreme leader, Jesus Christ. In Matthew, as we read in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20, right? So our involvement should be in obedience to this great command that has been given to us by our Savior and our Master. Now, secondly, our involvement should be based on our God-given talents, right? We've all got our abilities, the ability to stand up here to teach, the ability to reach out to our friends, the ability to draw really nicely, the ability to teach young students, the ability to work, the ability to move, the ability to live, right? All of us have been given different abilities. God gives to each one of us according to our own abilities in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 15. We're all familiar with the parable of the talents that has been recorded for us in the book of Matthew chapter 25 verse 14 to 30. I won't read the full verses, but allow me to quickly summarize for us that parable. The master in this instance, in Matthew chapter 25 verse 14 to 30, the master had given 3 servants some money. Each one of those servants was given different amounts. 2 out of those 3 invested that money to its fullest potential, but 1 of those servants didn't do anything with the money at all. Right? He simply kept it. When the master returned and asked for an account of his money, the one who did nothing with it was described as wicked and lazy. Lazy. Right? Wicked and lazy. The punishment for not using God's talents, God's given talents, is recorded for us in verse 30 of that book of Matthew chapter 25. In verse 30, the last verse, it says, "And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So, are we investing the talents that God has given to us wisely to do His will? Or are we hiding it, not using it, being lazy like the lazy servant was? Or even worse, actually, are we using our talents that have been given by God for other things instead of investing them in God's work? One is doing nothing. The lazy servant didn't do nothing, didn't steal, didn't do nothing. But you can use your talents for other things that go against God's work, and that's now called stealing. Right? That's even worse, right? So, third point is, lastly, our involvement. The last basis that our involvement should be on is that it should be based on our unconditional love. Our unconditional love for lost souls. I'm referring to the love that I'm referring to is the love of agape love. It's the love which is sacrificial, the love which is platonic, not romantic or sexual in nature. It's a sacrificial love for one another. In John 3:16, this love was shown to us through God, where it says, John 3:16, it reads, "God has such love for the whole world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life." Right? Everyone knows this verse. That is the love, that unconditional love that God has shown to us, that sacrificial love. And as God has shown His love for mankind, so are we then to also show that same love towards our fellow men as well. And also, not just to our fellow men and loved ones, but to our enemies almost. Matthew chapter 5 verse 44 says that. Not to the ones that you like or dislike, but to the ones that don't like you as well. Right? The second greatest command in the Bible is to love our neighbor as ourselves. Matthew chapter 22 verse 39 says this. So to summarize the second point then for today, all of us should be involved in the work of the church, and we should all do it based on the direct command that Christ has given to us. We have to be involved in it to the best of our abilities. And finally, we need to be involved with a loving, self-sacrificing attitude. The point number 3 this morning is, then what are some examples or some actions that we can do as members of the church? Members of the Church of Christ, to be considered as being involved. What are some of these examples? There are many ways. There are many ways to be involved in the workings of the church today. And as Brother Peter mentioned previously in one of his sermons a couple of weeks ago, that the work on the pulpit is not the only way to be involved in the church. All right, the least one can do to be involved is to be present. All right. In Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25, the verse continues on from verse 24. In verse 24, which was to consider one another to stir up love and good works, as we read. But in verse 25 of Hebrews chapter 10, it says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Now, in order to stir or be stirred, one must be at least there or present. Right? If you stir fry something when you're cooking, you stir fry something. You can't stir fry something if there's no oil or no ingredients in there, isn't it? They have to be present to be stirred. So you must be present for that stirring to happen. Otherwise, there can be no exhortation, no stirring of any kind. What is the difference then between being somewhere and being present? One can be somewhere but not present. What does that mean? Well, I did that most of my high school days. I was somewhere but not present, and that's why I failed a lot of my classes. But being somewhere, let me define this way. Being somewhere means geographically positioned. Okay, to be very exact, right? But being present is totally different. Being present means you're focused. Being present means you're engaged in the here and the now, and not distracted or mentally absent, which was me in school, right? If we are not mentally present in church, then can we honestly say that we are following the great commandment in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind? If your mind's not here, how can you say you're adhering to Matthew chapter 22, verse 37? Your mind is somewhere else? Good luck. Right? It's clear and simple. Fact. No dispute. We at Church Street. We at the Church Street Church of Christ assemble at 9:30 a.m. every Sunday for Bible class. And at 10:30 a.m. for our worship to God. We also assemble online every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. Every Wednesday. COVID. No. Every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. for Bible class. And the women assemble online every second Monday at 7:30 p.m. That one I remember. For Bible class as well, for their Bible classes. The church assembles for home fellowships once a month. These are just a couple of examples of the assemblies that the church members here at Church Street have planned together during our yearly planning sessions. And we should all make an effort to be here, be present geographically here, and also present, so that we can do what was mentioned, to stir up, Hebrews 10:24, to stir up one another and to exhort one another to do further good works, to be more involved. Okay? So what are some examples of involvement then? There are different areas that Christians of different ages can be involved in. So we've talked about different roles, but I'll talk about the ages now. For example, for younger Christians, right? Some areas of excuse me. Some areas of involvement can be in, for example, planning church activities. We just had the family day, which was carried out, right? And the young people came together to plan that activity. They should start to plan activities together so that they can foster a deeper bond with each other as they form the next generation of Christian leaders who will lead the future congregation here at Church Street. Young Christians should be involved, furthermore, in being a godly influence to their peers. Young Christians have lots of friends. We choose our friends. Not so many. Right? The young ones, we have so many friends. Everyone, every day, going out here and there, seeing people here and there. Lots of friends, right? We should strive to be a godly influence to our peers and not be influenced by our peers. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it then be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and be trampled underfoot by men." In the book of 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, it reads, "Let no one despise your youth, but be an example. Be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity." A byproduct of being influential to their peers is then being able to evangelize to them as well. As Paul wrote this in the book of to Timothy in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, we must be ready to preach the word, be ready in season and out of season to convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. But don't worry, if you are concerned about teaching, you could invite them to church, and other brethren can get involved in the teaching part. In this instance, you're not Caliphate, okay? You were involved. You at least asked for help. It's like if you go back to the first scenario where you see someone trying to commit suicide on the bridge. If you were just watching, you're just a Caliphate. But if you watch and you yell and ask for someone to come help, now you have at least been involved that much in saving that soul. Right? Now, for younger adults then, an area of involvement in the church could be making themselves more available for involvement. What do I mean for that? Making oneself more available for involvement. Some young adults who've entered the workforce and or entered parenthood, right, will become more busy and may begin to scale back their level of involvement because of that, right? But they should be careful not to take a back seat and become complacent in their involvement for the work of the Lord. Young adults can fall into the trap of thinking that because they have been involved for so long as young Christians, that they do not need to be involved as much anymore, and they should leave the work to the younger ones to do. They're more sprightly. They should go do the work, right? They tend to fall into that "let someone else do it" category. The verse in the book of Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8. In Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8, the verse did not say, "Here am I, Lord, send Jin." Right? The verse actually read, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Then I said, "Here am I, send me." We ought to remember the first basis point in point 2, that our involvement in the church is not an optional one. It's a command. Right? But how? So that's younger adults. How about the older saints? The older saints who are towards the end of their journeys here on earth. I'm just starting out my young adult life, so there's not much that I can say from my own experience. I've got probably one white hair. That's it. However, we have a few great examples of very involved older members of this church here in our community today at Church Street. Now, I'd like to mention a few actions that I have witnessed for us younger Christians to follow when we reach that period and that time in our lives. Now, older saints should keep on keeping on, right? We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, Paul wrote, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." And another example of involvement is as per my previous lesson on the role of women for older saints of women. One of the ways for older women to be involved in the church is by advising younger women in the church, as mentioned in Titus chapter 2 and verse 3 to 5. Titus 2, 3 to 5. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given too much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. So that is a couple of examples for the different age groups of involvement. Of course, doesn't end there. The list doesn't end there. It goes on for a very, very long time. But then I have to end my lesson, right? So there's just a few points. Now, point number 4. Finally, what are then, when you get involved, what are then the advantages? What's in it for me? What is the advantages? What are the rewards of being involved? Having covered the attitude towards involvement, the fact that all must be involved, right, and the action and ages of involvement, it is important now for us to focus upon the advantages of being involved. We must recognize the fact that God will reward his obedient children, as mentioned in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21. There are some other advantages that we can reap as a result as well of our involvement while we are still on earth, not after we pass, right? Matthew chapter 7 verse 21, we will be rewarded when we die. However, how about now? Some of the quick wins that we can get now. Our involvement as Christians, first off, one of the advantages that we can see now is that our involvement as Christians will draw us closer to each other. As Christians work together for the Lord's church, they will inevitably build closer relationships with one another. This is evident. It will happen, right? There is this song that Brother Randall leads sometimes. He puts it up. It's called God's Family, right? And it pens the outcome of the church that is involved together in doing God's work together. And one of the verses in the song reads, it says, "And sometimes we laugh together. Sometimes we cry. Sometimes we share together heartaches and sighs. Sometimes we dream together of how it will be when we all get to heaven, God's family." Now, there's also another song in the hymn book that echoes the same advantages as I just mentioned in the God's Family song by being actively involved together. And that song is called "Blessed Be the Tie That Binds." Now, another advantage of getting involved is that a person will experience spiritual growth by being involved, right? I can attest to this point personally because actively doing work for the Lord will cause one to actually build a stronger faith, and a stronger bond will result from that work with the Lord. Now, Paul said this to Titus in chapter 3 and verse 8 of the book of Titus, that maintaining good works is good and profitable unto all men. Our striving to exercise godliness will result in great gains spiritually. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. Now, I'll use this analogy to put my point across. I'll use this analogy of exercising your muscle. All of us go to the gym. Some of us used to go to the gym. Meaning. But you hopefully get the point. The more you exercise a muscle, the stronger and more toned it will be. Is it not? The more you eat, the fatter you go. That's also the same thing, right? The stronger and more toned it will be, the more you exercise it. So the more you exercise Using that same analogy, so the more you exercise your faith through involvement, the stronger then your faith will be and standing in the Lord will become. As it is not good enough to sit in the gym and expect results, right? It is not good enough to sit in the church and expect salvation. Okay? And a final advantage of being involved in the church is that our involvement will inevitably, by byproduct, reach out to the lost. By us being involved, we'll notice we are reaching out. We will be reaching out to the lost. This is the ultimate goal for us to be involved in the first place. It is so that we can carry out the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28. Likewise, there is no greater joy as when a sinner repents. I can tell you, as Luke chapter 15 and verse 10 records for us. It says, likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, to conclude this morning's lesson, we have hopefully been made aware of our need to be involved. We cannot blame it on our blind zones anymore, blind spots, right? We're now aware of our need to be involved and why we need to be involved. We have heard a couple of examples, just a couple of them, of how to become involved and what are some of the rewards and advantages of our involvement. But might I add one more caution to my lesson this morning? What is worse than a calafare? It sounds like a joke, right? It's not. What is worse than a calafare? What is worse than a calafare is someone who is not involved, does not participate, but goes around commenting and complaining about other people's involvement. That's worse than being a calafare. One thing to step behind. It's another thing to say, jump! Okay? What does the Bible have to say about this? In James chapter 5 and verse 9, the Bible says, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. I'm personally very glad to see the uptake in the level of involvement within the members in this Church of Christ in Church Street. It has increased definitely in the last couple of years. We've established in the last couple of years, we've established a steady women's fellowship group. We have a newsletter team. It used to be just one. Now it's a team, right? We have new converts, new Christians, new converts taking over leadership of the young adults program. We have more men involved in teaching and preaching during our Bible classes and our sermons, not just the one or the two anymore. We have more men getting involved in serving on Sundays during our worship sessions and on Bible classes as well. We have more members getting involved in teaching Sunday school and also personal Bible studies. We have members getting involved in setting up the IT system and maintaining the IT system and building as well and maintaining the church website. These are just some of the examples of the involvement that has happened in the past few years, right? And I'm glad to see this. So let us not, a message this morning, encouragement is to let us not grow weary. Let us not grow weary and dismayed in our involvement, but let us continue to strive and encourage one another, to stir up one another, to continue to be involved in the work of the church. Let us stir others who are not currently involved to become involved together with us in the work. Let us not point at people, but pull people into becoming involved together. Now, there is a difference between pointing and pulling. Again, there's opposite words, right? Pointing means that you are also on the outside, pointing towards somewhere else. Whereas pulling denotes that you are already inside, already involved, and you are pulling someone in to join you. As we pull lost souls into Christ, we will pull members into involvement, not point at members to involvement. Does that make sense? So let's not be the pointing, let's do the pulling. And if you're not able to pull, why don't you get into the position to pull?